Today's lecture will be on the brainstem. So the brainstem is a bidirectional pathway for all the tracks or axons extending from the cerebrum into the spinal cord to eventually the effector. In this area of the brainstem, it's divided into the diencephalon, which is composed of the thalamus and the pineal gland, the midbrain, which is divided into a tectile plate, the pons, the medulla oblongata. Many of the areas, especially in the pons and the medulla oblongata, contains many of the autonomic and reflex centers of the human body. They also house in the pons and medulla the nuclei of many of the cranial nerves. So the first area we'll begin our discussion is going to be with the midbrain. As we see here in the posterior department is a structure called a cerebral peduncle. This is where we see the motor tracks. They're located on the lateral and the anterior surface. But this is where the somatic motor axons descend from the primary motor cortex through this peduncle and eventually through the spinal cord. We also see in this region, located a little bit further down, an area called the superior cerebellar peduncle, and the superior cerebellar peduncles connects the cerebellum to the mesencephalon. Over on the other side, the tectile plate here, which is composed of the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi, located here and here, this area, the superior colliculi, is going to be primary are the visual reflex centers. This area helps visually track moving objects and controls reflexes such as turning the head or the eyes. The next structure in the midbrain is called an inferior colliculi. These are the auditory reflex centers, so this area is going to control the turning of the head and eyes to such things such as loud sounds or noises. The next region, begin the discussion, is going to be the pons. In the pons, we have both the sensory and motor tracts that are connecting from the brain through the spinal cord. The first area we'll look at is going to be the superior cerebellar peduncle, located, kind of shares an area with the midbrain, but located primarily in the pons. And this area is going to connect, again, the cerebellum to the mesencephalon. The next structure working down this area here is the middle cerebellar peduncle, and these transverse fibers, so they're running transversely, connects the pons to the cerebellum. And finally, the last structure in the pons on the anterior surface is going to be the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and this is going to connect the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata. And finally, the last structure is going to be the medulla oblongata. We can see here that the medulla oblongata is going to have the main cardiac center. So all the communication between the brain and the spinal cord will descend and ascend through the medulla oblongata. The first structure we'll talk about on the anterior surface, mostly on the lateral surface, is going to be the inferior olivary nucleus. This relay ascending sensory impulses, especially, or this area is going to be sending sensory impulses, especially proprioceptive information, to the cerebellar cortex. The nucleus cuneatus, this receives the posterior root fibers corresponding especially to sensory innervation from the arm and the hand of the opposite side, and the nucleus gracilis, which is going to receive the posterior root fibers carrying sensory information from the leg and the lower limb of the same side. So when we take a cross-sectional view of the midbrain, the first area is to discuss this region here, which is the tegmentum. The tegmentum is going to be between the substantia nigra and the para-aqueductal gray matter, and these structures located within between are going to integrate information from the cerebrum and the cerebellum and gives the involuntary motor commands to especially the erector spinae muscles for posture. In this area, we see the first structure, which is called a red nucleus. The red color comes from blood vessels, the blood vessel density, and iron pigmentations in the neuronal cell bodies. But more importantly, involuntary motor commands to the erector spinae. The next area is going to be the darker shaded area or region, which is called the substantia nigra. And this is going to houses clusters of neurons that produce the neurotransmitter dopamine. They also control human movement. They controls emotional responses and the ability to experience pleasure or pain. We see this as an area, especially as related to dopamine. This degeneration of this area is a pathway to the pathology of Parkinson's disease. The next area is going to be on the posterior surface, this region called the tectum. This acts as a relay station in processing a pathway of visual and auditory sensations. And then we have over here part of the region of the tactile plate, which is going to be first the superior colliculi. And again, this is for the visual reflex center. So this area is going to help track moving objects and control reflexes, such as turning the eyes and the head to some sort of a visual stimuli. And finally, what we see is the cerebral aqueduct, which is important for cerebral spinal fluid. This region connects the third and fourth ventricles, and it's also going to be surrounded by this para-aqueductal gray matter or neuron cell bodies. So a detailed look at the pons, what we're looking at is especially the fact that it's going to house in the pons in this region here, these three axon extensions. These are going to house the sensory and motor cranial nerve nuclei for trigeminal or cranial nerve number 5, the abducens, which is cranial nerve number 6, and the facial cranial nerve number 7. So one of the areas that when we're looking at this is going to be over here on the right is going to be the middle cerebellar peduncle. And again, this is an area where we see the transverse fibers here are going to be connecting from the pons to the cerebellum. More importantly, what we see is this pontine respiratory center. This pontine respiratory center was previously referred to as the pneumotaxic center. This area, along with the medullary respiratory center in the medulla, this area specifically is going to regulate the skeletal muscles of breathing. Also, what we see in the pons is the superior olivary complex, and this is located as noted in the inferior portion of the pons, and this area receives audio input and is involved in the pathway for sound localization. And then taking a little bit more of a detailed look at the medulla. When we're looking at the medulla, we call this the cardiac center. So this area, the medulla, all the information between the brain and the spinal cord are going to eventually descend or ascend through this area. On the anterior surface, it shows it here. There's actually going to be 3 that correlate, but these are the pyramids. So we see one here, and they've just removed this one, and then another one would be here. But these pyramids, this area is going to house the motor projection tracts, also called the corticospinal, or what we consider to be called the pyramidal tracts. So it is holding on to an area of the motor projections. And we can see as it travels down through the track, it's eventually going to come to this structure or intercrossing, which we call a decussation of the pyramid. And this is where we're going to see informations, or the axons are going to cross to the opposite side of the brain. So any sensory information leading up through the decussation of the pyramid along these motor axon tracts or pyramids will eventually trigger into the right side of the brain. We also see that this is a very important region for the vestibular cochlear nerve, or cranial nerve number 8, the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve number 12, and the vagus nerve, which is the cranial nerve number 10. And the vagus nerve is very beneficial, or is closely associated with the heart. So looking on the right side, if we look on the right side of the picture, we see an inferior olivary nuclei. And this is going to be relaying any ascending sensory impulses, especially sensory impulses dealing with proprioceptive information, to the cerebellum. The nucleus cunatus over here, it's this region. This is going to receive all the posterior root fiber corresponding to sensory intervention from the arm and the hand of the opposite side. And then here, further laterally, we see the nucleus gracilis. This is going to receive all the posterior root fiber or sensory information from the leg and the lower limb of the same side. And then the next one is going to be the medial, over here on the left side, the medial lemniscus, which is located close to the pyramid. And these projections project through brainstem to the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus. We also see this area is very important for the cardiac and vasomotor centers. So the cardiac center, which is going to regulate the heart rate and the strength of contraction. And then the vasomotor centers, which are also housed in this dark purple area, they're going to control the blood pressure by regulation of the smooth muscles in the walls of the arterioles to alter vessel diameter, such things as vasodilation and vasoconstriction. And finally, the last major group in the medulla is going to be called the respiratory center. This is going to regulate respiratory rate and are influenced by the pontine respiratory center and the pons. So the pons can have direct control over the ventral respiratory group of the medulla. Other things or structures, other functions that the medulla oblongata participates in, it controls the cough response, sneezing responses, salivation, the swallowing, any type of gagging and vomiting are going to come from the medulla. So when we look at the cerebellum, the main job of the cerebellum, we see that it's composed of both the gray and the white matter, but its main job is for fine-tuning skeletal muscle movement to make them smooth, coordinated movements. They store all previously learned patterns. So the first area that we look at is going to be the folia, or these folds of the cerebellar cortex. And then inside of these folds, we're going to see regions such as the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, and they're going to be separated. They're slightly off color, but this region right here, this is going to be the primary fissure that is going to separate the anterior from the posterior fold. Together, the anterior and the posterior fold will compose of the cerebellar hemisphere, or one region. So you'd have a left cerebellar hemisphere that's composed of anterior and posterior, and you'd also have a right cerebellar hemisphere. These hemispheres are separated by this narrow band of cortex, and this area, the vermis, receives all sensory input about torso position and balance. So as mentioned, the outer layer, this darker region of the cortex, is going to be considered to be gray matter, and then the inner layer has almost the projections of white matter projecting into the gray matter, and this is the arbor vitae, or what we call in layman's terms the tree of life. So again, when we're looking at the functions of the cerebellum, it's going to adjust all skeletal activity to maintain equilibrium and posture. And then we're also going to see with this region, it's receiving proprioception about the muscles and the joints of the human body. And finally, the last component or structure in the brainstem is going to be the limbic system. So to get our arrangement, one of the things that we're looking at in the limbic system is this would be the hypothalamus here and the pituitary gland. And the limbic system, it has multiple cerebral and diencephalic structures that process and experience emotions. So when we're looking at these, they are going to affect memory formation by integrating past memories of physical sensations with emotional stress. So the first structure we look at is the cingulate gyrus. It's kind of the cap of the limbic system. And this is going to receive input from all the components of the limbic system. It focuses its attention on emotional significant events and brings them into some form of consciousness. The next structure is going to be the parahippocampus gyrus, which is located on the opposite end or more inferior. And the parahippocampal gyrus is associated with the temporal lobe function, and it's also associated with the main structure, which is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is very important because it's going to primarily store memory and forming all forms of long-term memory. The amygdaloid body, moving a little bit further, you can see as the hippocampus comes down, it forms a structure called the amygdaloid body, and this is where we have our fear responses. We store and code memories based on how a person receives them, such as fear, extreme happiness, or other emotions such as sadness. And then we also have components of the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract. So this would be the olfactory tract that eventually leads to the olfactory bulbs. And this area significantly is going to be the structures that we see when odors provoke some type of an emotional response. And the last structure we'll talk about is going to be the fornix, which is underneath the cingulate gyrus. And the fornix is a thin track of white matter connecting the hippocampus. So it comes all the way down here. It connects the hippocampus with all the other limbic structures.